All right, everyone, welcome to our webinar from the Maryland School for the Blind about blind and low vision students with autism. We're really excited to have Damato with us today. And I put some information in the chat box where if you can get a certificate for contact hours. And we would love it if you filled out a survey after this webinar about your experience and your expectation of this webinar. We're very open to feedback, and you can check out all our other events and webinars on the link that's also in the chat box for our TVI portal in Maryland. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Nai. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to jot them down in the chat box, and I will let Nai know of any chats. All right, go ahead. Welcome, Nai.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Damato. I'm the Director of Rehab and DeafBlind Services at Columbia Lighthouse for the Blind, and I am blind and autistic myself. So I hope that today will be informative for everyone. So I do have a PowerPoint included with this that you'll be getting afterwards, and I'll go through each slide and let people know when to go to the next slide for those of you who are also tuning in on the phone and might not be able to see the PowerPoint. First page, with low vision students with autism. I've worked with a number of students, K through 12, and also adults who are both somewhere on the blindness spectrum and somewhere on the autism spectrum. And so much of what I'm presenting today is also pulling from that experience in addition to my own. So I'm going to the next slide now, blindness/low vision, with 3 points: visual acuity, the inability to see detail, or difficulty with distance viewing. So when people hear blindness, a lot of times people think, oh, you can't see anything at all, right? So people's idea of blindness is that you either see everything or you see nothing. But blindness is actually a spectrum, and there's different degrees and types of blindness. So the first one, visual acuity, that refers to how sharp or blurry an image is. And so someone who has a poor acuity might not be able to see fine print or might not be able to see facial expressions on someone's face, and they need the object to be closer and larger in order for them to see it. It's often described in terms of a certain number over 20, and what that means is that what a typical person would see at a certain number of feet is what the person with the visual impairment can see at 20 feet. So 2200, for example, means that what someone can usually see at 200 feet, this person sees at 20 feet. 2 on this slide is visual field, peripheral field vision, central field, and hemianopia. So one of the ways people can also have a vision loss is that they have a visual field loss, and that means that it can be in the periphery, or it's like they're looking through a tunnel or a straw, and so they're only seeing what's directly in front of them and not what's off to the sides or above or below. Or someone can have part of their visual field missing, such as the lower part. And hemianopia actually refers to having one side of each visual field blind. So that's because the way that your eyes connect to your brain, it crisscrosses. So if you have brain damage to one side of your brain, for example, rather than it making the opposite eye blind, it makes the opposite visual field of each eye blind. And there's also central field loss, which refers to like that you have blindness in the very center and you can see around the edges. And so that usually affects reading more. Typically people use their central field in order to see fine print. There's also other types of vision field loss, such as a donut, which, as the name suggests, you have a little bit of central loss and then a bit around the edges, or there can be just different spots. It depends on the cause. And then the third and lesser known, this is number 3 on the PowerPoint that says visual processing, neurological visual impairment, and sensory processing disorders. This refers to how your brain interprets information or how the information gets from your eye to your brain. So many people, they think of blindness as being in the eyeball and of vision being in the eyeball. But actually only 10% of seeing is in your eyeball. The remaining 90% are complex processes and pathways inside your brain. In some ways, actually, anatomically, your eyes are more of an extension of your brain. So it's very much a neurological process. And it takes up a significant amount of the space in your brain and a significant amount of the glucose that your brain uses to process vision. So seeing as autism is neurological, it can also cause that type of blindness where it's not necessarily a matter of not getting the input on the eyeball, but that what the brain does with that input isn't working right. So that can be the whole spectrum as well. People can have a very minor visual processing issue, or the visual processing can be so severe that the information coming in is meaningless, like looking through a kaleidoscope, or it can be inaccurate, so they just can't judge distances, they can't recognize or identify objects. So someone might even have perfect acuity and visual field, but their brain doesn't. So those are the 3 major ways of having vision loss, and many people have a combination of 2 or more of those, depending on what their vision history is. And the latter one, the visual processing, is a lot more common when someone has both vision loss and is on the autism spectrum. Any questions so far?
Doesn't seem like it so far. Go ahead. I'll let you know if there's a question.
So I'm going to go to the next slide, which is the autism spectrum. And here, before I go into the next 2 points on the PowerPoint slide, I just want to mention that we look at autism as a spectrum of more to less severe symptoms, kind of like a 2-dimensional spectrum. But a lot of times people experience certain symptoms more in constellations. So autism has different components to it, where there's the sensory part, there's the part that has to do with social interactions, there's the part that has to do with executive functioning, that's the ability to do procedures and complete tasks. Remember, you have to do something and get it done. All those different components can be affected differently, as well as the ability to speak verbal language. And one component might be more severely impacted than another, but they don't always correlate. So someone might have the ability to speak, for example, but have very serious struggles with executive functioning, or someone might have a lot of struggle with executive functioning. I mean, might not struggle with executive functioning, but might have a very hard time with finding words and being able to speak. So just keep that in mind, that it's more of a cluster, it's more of a constellation and less of a 2-dimensional spectrum. So with that in mind, 1, communication styles. Speaking using alternative augmentative communication, sign language, or a combination depending on the environment. And so obviously there's some people on the spectrum who speak. For example, I'm speaking now with my own voice. Some people might need to use alternative or augmentative communication devices, and that can refer to different technologies. It can be anything from an iPad. In previous times, someone might have used a typewriter. Some people with autism prefer to type. Some prefer to use picture-based communication methods, just to show context. Some people with autism find sign language easier to use than spoken language. And then some autistic people use a combination depending on the So some people might have speech at certain times and then they might lose speech at other times due to stress or being overwhelmed, or might simply be a matter of their comfort. There could be all kinds of factors. The second part on the slide says 2 sensory issues, and here's auditory processing issues, sensory integration issues, touch aversion or touch seeking behavior, and need for self-stimulating to process sensory input. So one of the things which is true for both autistic, sighted, or blind is that many of us use auditory processing. So we might hear the sound from an audiology point of view, but might not be able to understand it very easily. For example, I have a hard time if there's overlapping speech. If 2 people speak at once, I have no idea what either of them said. Or another example is with music. I can't for the life of me understand lyrics over music because my brain can either process music or language, but not both at the same time. So those are examples of auditory processing. Someone just might not be able to differentiate similar sounds, like P as in Paul versus D as in David. And that can affect the classroom environment. Some people might have not necessarily processing issues concentrated on one modality, such as hearing, but might have a hard time integrating all of the different sensory information together. So if you imagine, for example, in a classroom, there's a lot of sounds, there's a lot of texture, there's a chair that you're sitting on, there might be smells, and someone maybe just sprayed some Febreze or used some Clorox wipes. There's all these things, and the brain has a hard time taking all this and integrating and processing at the same time. There are people that fall all over the spectrum in terms of whether they like touch or do not like touch. That can be clothes, texture of foods, that can be how someone's touched. So some people prefer to be lightly touched, some prefer more pressure. Some people like to explore with their hands, and then other people would prefer not to touch things. And then what's also very common is that many people need to do self-stimulating behaviors in order to be able to process sensory input. So that might be something like hand flapping or rocking or playing with a little toy. Maybe you guys are familiar with that whole trend before with the fidget spinners. So I often have a little piece of cloth in my pocket or a gemstone, something pretty discreet, and I might just play with it. It helps me to focus and concentrate. All right, any questions so far on this? And if you do come up with a question after the fact, I'm gonna have an opening at the end for more questions. So if you don't get a chance to ask your question here, just save it for the end. All right, so we talked about blindness and we've talked about autism, but what about when they happen together at the same time in the same individual? Often people compensate for vision loss by introducing auditory or tactile ways of doing things, which is also the first bullet point on this next slide. It says blindness often compensated for with auditory tactile techniques. The second bullet says autism compensated for with visual techniques. And the third bullet says blind autistics need their own set of unique adaptations. So many people think of multiple disabilities as A plus B equals AB, right? So, okay, someone who's blind autistic is just like autism plus the blindness, but that's not the way it works. Being blind autistic is more than the sum of its parts, because you can't necessarily use one strategy that would work for a sighted autistic person to compensate for a blind autistic person. And a strategy that might work for a blind person who's not autistic, or what's called allistic, that's A-L-L-I-S-T-I-C, might not work for someone who's blind autistic. So For example, many people in the sighted autistic community use what's called communication, where they'll wear something that's green means you can interact with me, yellow means only with somebody I know, and red means don't interact with me at all. Great strategy for people who can see the badges, right? But for someone who's blind autistic, we'd need to think of something different, either using technology, like maybe having an app where you can put on a busy or do not disturb, or open to chat kind of status, or you would need to figure out some other kind of system, like maybe have in a specific classroom, you'd have a list on the wall in Braille or large print or whatever was needed, and people could change their status on that list or something like that. So that's the kind of thing where you need to think creatively and remember that being blind and autistic is not the same as 1 plus 2, blind plus autism. Any questions on this so far? All right, now I'm going to move to the next slide, which is called accessing text. So there are 3 major categories on this slide. The first is print accommodations, and that's students with near normal acuity may still need extra large font and extra spacing between letters, words, and lines. So I was talking before about visual processing and neurological visual impairment. And so with somebody who has an ocular or eyeball-based cause of blindness, that's relatively mild, where they would normally still be able to see 16-point font or 18-point font, might still benefit from much larger font because their brain needs the extra support with processing. With neurological visual impairments, it always helps to have less clutter, and it helps the brain process because bigger and simpler is easier for the brain to deal with. So you might still give that kind of a student 24-point font or 36-point font. Extra spacing between letters, words, and lines makes a big difference for the brain as well. That you can change in kerning. It's called kerning, K-E-R-N-I-N-G. And you can add more than one space, like you can press space 3 times between each word. And you can do double spacing or 1.5 times spacing. That can be really helpful for students who are low vision, who still have a considerable amount of vision, but still need that extra support. 2 on the slide says tactile accommodations. And it says Braille may be beneficial despite significant usable vision due to NVI. Braille tactile models in certain textures and raised tactile graphics for picture exchange communication system PECs. So as I was saying before about the neurological visual impairment, because autism has such an effect on visually processing whatever residual vision someone does have, someone who would still be able to see print might still benefit from having that tactile reading method. So, for example, someone who has 420 vision and would normally just rely on magnification might still benefit from Braille because it may be easier for their brain to process text through touch than through vision. For those who are anywhere on the blindness spectrum from low vision to totally blind, it might still be beneficial to use Braille in different textures. And that I will go into more on another slide. But just to give an example, Braille is available in electronic Braille. It's available on plastic. It can be, you maybe have seen those signs on the elevator where there's the little metal Braille next to the numbers on the buttons. So those textures can make a difference. And then for those of you who are familiar with using PECs, those kinds of pictures can be created in raised line graphics or tactile graphics, or objects, 3D objects could be used as a communication system as well. So it's essentially taking the concept of PECs but making it accessible non-visually. The third category on the slide says speech output accommodations. Text-based apps for speech output and adjusting speech settings to maximize auditory processing. So just as you might be familiar with the PEX system, there are programs that work with screen readers, and a screen reader is a type of software that converts text into speech. So I'll actually play my screen reader just so people can hear it. Where'd you go? I've been using my Braille display, so my volume must be.
Traveling in classroom slide. Accessing text slide.
I don't know if everyone was able to hear that, but my screen reader just read what slide we're on the accessing text slide. And so that can be adjusted and used with the text kinds of software like Proloquo. Or the other thing to consider is that because many people with autism have auditory processing disorders, it's very important to make sure that if they're using a screen reader, that the voice is a rate where they can understand it. You can choose between male, female voices. So you can pick one that's easier on the person's ears. And then you can also change the rate of the speech, pitch, even within that voice. And you can try out voices with different accents. Some people have an easier time understanding a voice with a certain accent, for example, than others. So that's something you can keep in mind, and you'll just want to really customize that for your student. Any questions on accessing text? All right, I'll go to the next slide, which is traveling in the classroom. So this has a few different points. The first is that blind autistic students sometimes don't locate sound as well as blind allistic students. So one of the things that many blind allistics, and just to remind everyone that's someone who is not autistic, rely on is the ability to locate sound. So for example, I will hear that my coworker was passing the hallway and I can hear where they are. A lot of blind people rely heavily on sound location, even those who have significant vision, because one of the first things that becomes more difficult, even with a slight visual loss, is being able to see how far or close something is. So many people rely on that. But being autistic can actually make that process a bit more difficult because it's neurological. It requires a lot of coordination in your brain between the vision cortex and the surrounding areas in order to locate that sound. Being autistic can affect that. So whereas with most blind people, you might be able to snap and say here, and they can hear right where that is, your blind autistic student might need a little more support, like saying in front of you, or saying to the left or what have you. And then some blind autistics have difficulty with visual mapping skills when traveling. That's the next point on the PowerPoint. And so just to be clear, this is not necessarily true of all people. This just can happen with some. But both autistics who have ocular blindness conditions or who are blind from a neurological condition can have a harder time with visual mapping. Those who are just blind rely heavily on being able to consider a bird's eye view, for example, and think of what side of the building are the stairs on or what have you. And all those hidden skills that help with successful travel when you're blind can be more difficult when you're also autistic. So I know that, for example, I always have had the hardest time remembering what side of the building the stairs were on when I was in school, and I would get mixed up constantly, and that could actually delay me on my way to class because I'd be so sure that if I went straight ahead. So that's just something to keep in mind. The next point on the slide says may need to rely on narrative or other non-visual techniques. So in order to supplement difficulty with visual mapping, it can help to have a narrative. So say, go to the end of the hallway, make the left, come up with steps verbally. Or like, oh, coffee, I'm past lounge or what have you. Things that require those mapping skills so be helpful for students blind autistic. And then the next point on the slide says students with occupancy may still miss obstacles due to NVI. So I was talking before about how neurological and visual impairment can happen even if you see something physically, your brain's not registering it. So students who do have an ocular condition where they maybe don't have such good acuity might still miss things that someone else without autism and with their same acuity level would see. And that's because that neurological component of visual processing is always a bigger layer in any sort of vision impairment. So just keep that in mind, that just because you know your student should be able to see you standing off to the side, they still might miss you because of that visual processing. And then the last point on this slide, and maybe the most fascinating, is that some neurological visual impairments result in unconscious detection of obstacles, but no conscious sight. So if you have a student who reports not being able to see anything, but you notice they're moving fluidly around chairs and tables, and you're thinking, wait, what? This kid's acting like they can totally see. Keep in mind that some neurological visual impairments are actually such that the person has no conscious vision, so they're not aware of seeing anything, but subconsciously their brain is still able to pick up on objects. That's due to the anatomy. Again, it's a very complex system of visual processing. There's a lot of pathways that go from the eye to the back of your brain, and there's a more primal visual system that everyone has. It's the visual system that is invoked when you see movement out of the periphery of your eye, that sort of automatic snap reaction that you have in a situation of danger. So some people might have a neurological condition that makes their conscious vision blanked out, but they still have that more primal vision system that's picking up on stuff. So that basically means that you can't necessarily rely on child's behavior with travel skills as an indication of how much they're seeing all the time. They might be subconsciously navigating around that table or chair, but still not consciously seeing it. So just keep that possibility in mind. Any questions so far? All right, I'm going to go to the next slide, which is blind autistic norms in the classroom. And this has a series of bullet points as well. So the first one, and I really want to emphasize this one, is that blind autistic cultural norms are not a sign of disrespect or disengagement. So this happens a lot in educational settings where there's a very strong emphasis on teaching students how to be respectful, but a lot of those norms, those cultural norms, are based on holistic ways of being. So sometimes there's a mismatch there between what the autistic blind student is trying to say or trying to do and the way it gets interpreted by staff who aren't blind and autistic. And I would say this is also true of any autistic students in general, but this becomes even more pronounced with being blind autistic because there's not those visual cues as well. So just keep in mind that there is a cross-cultural difference. Just like some cultures value eye contact and others don't, or with some cultures it's more polite to be direct and other cultures it's more polite to be indirect. being autistic is a different culture. It's not just a disability, but a different way of being. For example, when I walk into a room that's predominantly autistic people, we have our own set of social norms that emerge. So keep that in mind, and treat your communications as cross-cultural. The next point on the slide says that students with usable vision may not be able to look and listen. This kind of goes back to that sensory processing. Another big piece of the educational setting, especially with students who have some usable vision where they can be looking at things, is there's often a sense of look at this and also listen to the instructions at the same time. That's placing a high demand on the person's brain, and not all autistic students will be able to do that. So you may have to break things up to sequential instead of simultaneous steps. So rather than saying, look at this diagram, or they're following a diagram by touching top left corner, blah, blah, blah. You may need to give them a chance to look or feel the diagram first, and then go into description. Look first, then listen, or vice versa. The next point on the slide says that they may need to stim or use a stim tool to try to focus and learn effectively. So some students are going to have to need to be fidgety, and it's not because they're being rude or they don't care. That might actually be what their brain needs in order to be able to focus. So that could be hand slapping, that could be the rocking, and that could also be having a toy. That introduces a complicating factor. When you're in a group setting, certain ways of stimming can be distracting. So in those situations, I recommend trying to brainstorm of a way in order to let the student be able to stim that's not distracting to others. So instead of a toy that makes noise, you can find a quiet toy or something like that. But basically, expecting a student not to stim is kind of like expecting you not to cry when you're very sad, or not to laugh when something's hilarious. It's almost impossible to stop that impulse, and it actually makes learning harder. So you'll find that there's more success with what the student's learning when you allow them to stim and do what their brain needs to do. Stim toy is a term like the fidget spinner, where the very purpose of something that someone's holding is to provide that stimulation. And really anything can be a stim toy, like a pen. I had a supervisor at one point who he would take his pen and he would go like this, and he would click it to death, and that's how I always knew he was there. So that's the kind of stim that might be distracting to others, but you could try to find something that feels clicky but doesn't sound clicky as an alternative. The next point on this slide is difference in use of phrasing and tone are not intended as rudeness. So again, there's a lot of emphasis, especially in certain cultures, on using indirect phrasing as politeness. So instead of saying, I need your help, you might say, like, could you help me with something? That whole aspect of language is very much based on being allistic, and that doesn't come naturally to a lot of autistics. The same goes for the tone. So that's true of autistics in general, but again, with blind autistics, this is even more true because they're not having the visual component means they're more focused on the auditory component, but being blind autistic also means that they might be missing some of those cues that you would expect someone who's blind to hear. So a lot of blind autistics will be very sensitive to tone, or very hyper aware of word choice, but autistics may still be hyper aware of those things, but might have different judgments about what they think sounds reasonable or polite or what have you. So just keep that in mind when you're communicating with your blind autistic students. The next point on the slide says, not following instructions may be due to inability, not unwillingness. So there might be times where your student is overwhelmed, or where they're missing a visual cue. Like if you say, everybody come over here, they might not know where that here is, or they might not be able to sound locate. And so keep in mind that a student not following instructions may be because they're literally not able to do so. And that's when you'll want to think about what could be happening that's not accessible to your student and what would need to be done differently. Give students the benefit of the doubt. Don't always assume right off the bat that they're being obtuse in general or on purpose. Which brings me to the next point on this slide, and that's to dig deeper for the underlying reason for any behavior. So anytime there is a behavior that's different from the norm, whether they're, making a ton of sound, or they're being really blunt, or what have you, try to dig deeper and understand what the reason is behind that behavior, and don't just assume an intent that would be based on if someone was sighted and allistic. And I already went over the last point here, which says treat all communication as cross-cultural. So again, being autistic is not just a disability, it's also a culture. So there are cross-cultural communication issues that can come up, just like if you're talking to someone from another country or from a very different generation, or there might be those cross-cultural differences. All right, any questions so far? Okay, so now I'm going to go into some case scenarios. I feel like I've lectured at you guys for long enough. So case one is Aziza, and this is on a new PowerPoint slide. Aziza is a nonverbal low vision student and relies on text for communication. In cluttered environments, her residual vision is unreliable, and she therefore also depends on speech output. There's a picture on this slide of the PEC system, so it has many different little pictures and words, and on it she's created a sentence that says, I will say what I think, y mostrar quién soy. That latter part was Spanish for and show who I am, and that's to indicate that the software is actually available in Spanish as well. That is a screenshot of Prola Quotago, which is one of the many applications that is based on the PEC system, and that's actually can be used with VoiceOver, which is the screen reader used on the iPad. So a student who, such as Aziza, would be able to use PEC with VoiceOver in order to communicate in a cluttered environment. And that's an example of how she can be accommodated specifically. So there's a lot of creativity that goes into accommodating, because you have to take pieces from each disability and figure out how to bring them together in a way that's actually going to work. A more low-tech version of this would be to have the PEC system maybe with either large print or Braille, and the pictures could either be more simplistic or they could be raised lines. Someone who has some vision might benefit from having very bright colors. That's a very useful one for autistics who have usable vision, because color is processed in more than one part of your brain. I think it's 5 different parts of your brain. So that's often the easiest for your brain to pick up and process if it's within your ocular vision. So that's Aziza. Any questions on this case scenario?
So actually, yeah, there was a question. This person says, so sometimes self-stimulating behaviors increase in intensity. I believe you are saying that this may not be a sign of distraction, but a sign that the student is trying to concentrate more. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So stimming and stim toying can be signs that the student is more focused and more concentrated on what they're trying to do on the task at hand, not less so. Exactly. That's something that I know is very counterintuitive for a lot of people, because in general, it's a pretty safe assumption that if somebody starts fidgeting, that they're not paying attention. But it's true that when it comes to someone who's autistic or blind autistic, that's actually a sign that, or it can be a sign that they're actually paying more attention. It could also be a sign that they're trying to regulate their emotions or something like that. And that's part of a bigger piece of trying to stay focused. Any questions about the PEC system used with a screen reader? Sorry about that, off the phone, okay. I will go to the next slide, and if someone has questions, we can always come back to it at the end. Here's example case 2, Felix. So this is the next slide, and it says Felix has no usable vision. He's a Braille reader. However, he has a strong aversion to the texture of paper and refuses to touch anything with paper, including hard copy paper Braille. And on this slide, there's a picture of an electronic Braille display. So what that is there's a line of text with little pins that pop up and down in Braille patterns. I actually took a picture of my own Braille display for this, so that's actually the Braille display I use at work. And there's a little caption that says an electronic refreshable Braille display. The 2 dots at the very end represent the cursor. So those 2 dots blink, and just like the cursor blinks in a Word document, those 2 dots blink on the Braille display. And if I hold my phone up, you might be able to hear it on mine. That's audible to people, but it's a little clicking sound. So that's one way that you can access Braille in a way that's not paper texture. So if Felix won't touch paper Braille, maybe he can get a Braille display through the school or through services and be able to access his textbooks and other materials through the Braille display.
And I'm just going to put in a comment real quick, Nye. If you are a TVI in Maryland, we have Braille displays on loan, so your county does not have to purchase. You can request them through MSD or you can email me.
Thanks for that, Conchita. And something else to note is that there are more Braille displays coming out that are more reasonable prices. So they've typically been in the thousands, but there are a few new models like the Braille Me and the Orbit that are more like $500. So if it's hard to advocate for that budget-wise, that's sort of where you can start. It's a better solution than nothing. And then I'm going to go to the next slide. And on this slide, it's titled Braille Textures. And on the top, there's some paper Braille. It's on traditional Braille hard copy paper, and on the bottom it's the same Braille except it's been typed onto sticky paper. So if you ever made sticky labels and you print the label on it and then you peel off the plastic and then you have the underlying paper, that's what I used to make the Braille on that paper, and that's a completely different texture than paper, and so someone like Felix might be able to read that without having the aversion that he has to the paper. So it's about thinking outside of the box and thinking of creative solutions specific student needs, because of course the blind autistic student is going to have different preferences, whereas one touch paper, another might love the texture. So it's just about that individual student needs. Any questions on this slide? Okay, I'll move on to the next case scenario. Example case 3 is AJ. This is on a new slide. And it says, AJ has escaped the playground during recess and found a way to hide in a classroom. You, the teacher, notice AJ while walking down the hallway. You walk in and flip on the lights. You say to AJ, "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be outside with everyone else." AJ gives no verbal answer. You ask several more times and still no answer. How would you proceed, and what do you think could be going on? So this is my question to you all. what would you do in a situation like this, and what do you think might be happening? How come you think AJ's not replying to you? And don't forget to,
oh, go ahead.
I was saying, don't forget to unmute.
Yeah, or you can type in your answers in the chat box. This one says he may be overstimulated from being outside with a lot of visual and auditory complexity. And then this person says, can you hear me, Natasha? No, we could not.
Thanks, Conchita. So that's a great, that's great that the AJ was probably overstimulated in the playground, and that's why they went into the classroom. And then let's see what Natasha wanted to say.
Let me see if I can unmute you, Natasha, because you are muted. Let's see. Okay. All right, Natasha, now you are unmuted. Go ahead. Oh, it muted you again. Okay, I'm not really sure what happened.
Are you able to, Natasha, for question?
Maybe they can type it. Okay, this person says, ooh, okay, we got more. Okay, Natasha was saying, actually, I was asking if he could hear the teacher. And then another person says, turning on the light may have had a negative effect, so turn it off. And the next person says, approach him once you know he knows who is there, ask calming questions, and ask if he needs anything.
So those are all great approaches, and I'm so happy to hear that you all are already thinking of these ways of approaching the situation. So yes.
And actually, there's another one. Sorry, there's another one. It says, AJ may be needing a quiet environment. Maybe the playground was overwhelming. Turn off the lights and monitor.
Perfect. Great thoughts, everyone. Thank you. So yes, the lights can actually, just flipping on the lights can be a big thing. And some people might think, oh, you're blind autistic, you wouldn't notice that. But a lot of blind autistics are very light sensitive. I actually am very light sensitive, and I'm happily sitting in my office in the dark. I work in the so painful.
There's another comment. It says, approach him once you know he knows who is there. Ask calming questions and ask if he needs anything.
That's another great approach to make sure that AJ knows who's there, and to give AJ that sense of familiarity. That can definitely help. So one of the ways we might do that is saying who you are by name. AJ may or may not be able to identify your voice. And then flipping off the lights, as we already discussed. And one of the reasons I use this example is I actually used a blind autistic person who had speech when the lights were off. But if you turned on fluorescent lights, that person would lose speech. So something like flipping on the lights or flipping them off can be the difference between the blind autistic person being able to speak or not. And then the calming questions is also great for emotional regulation and helping the student to ground after being in a noisy, overwhelming playground. So great thoughts on that. Thanks for your input, everyone. Any other comments on this?
Nope, I think those were it.
Okay. So the next slide I'm going to is tips and takeaways. So remember to be flexible, to ask and don't assume, and to include the student. And I really want to emphasize the third one, to include the student. I've sat in many IEP meetings where the team of professionals, all very well-meaning, are having a discussion about what would be best for the student, but the student is either there or not there, and no one thinks to ask the student what would work best for them. So just keep in mind that at the end of the day, the student is the expert on what they need in terms of they experience being in their body and in their mind every day. Like one time I was in an IEP meeting and a bunch of the professionals in the room had decided that this student would benefit most from speech output. So then I asked the student and they said, actually, no, Braille works a lot better for me. So that's something that would have been missed without including the student. And while there is a layer of what somebody needs, preferences make a big difference. Even if someone can access both speech and Braille, for example, one might be better than the other. Or if someone can read paper Braille, but it's much more difficult than reading electronic Braille or what have you. So always remember to include the student as much as possible in these decisions. And
Hey,
that's gradual.
There's a comment and also a question, sort of, I guess. So I think they're talking about the case we were just talking about, AJ, and Denise says, however, it is not safe for him to choose a random room. If this is the pattern, then he needs to have a pre-planned location to escape to where there is supervision. And then this person says, kind of commenting on Denise's to make sure that I saw it, and just wants to get your feedback on that.
That's a great point. If AJ keeps escaping over and over again, it's good to address that on a larger scale of maybe AJ shouldn't be expected to go out in the playground in the first place, and maybe AJ needs a quiet and safe, low stimulus setting to be able to retreat during break where there is no adult supervision. So maybe there's, that someone's always a certain teacher will be in the room during break and they would agree to have AJ to just be there or what have you. So that's a great point. Thank you for saying that. And that's actually an example where you might include the student, because when you're thinking of what that place could be, the student might have the best suggestions in mind, and then you as the team could decide which place could actually be arranged. So that brings us to the final slide. I wanted to open up the floor for questions, and I just wanted you to know that you'll be getting this PowerPoint, and it has my contact information, my email, which is ndamato@clb.org, my text and my phone number are on there, and it has the logo of Columbia Lighthouse for the Blind where I work. So Conchita will be emailing out this PowerPoint, and you'll be able to follow more questions after today.
So feel free, y'all, to type into the chat box, and I'll just read them out loud. So Kathleen says, this is a tip. She says, slowing down and using a lot of wait time to encourage a response and having less auditory complexity.
Oh, that's a great strategy. Definitely the slower pace and allowing some time for processing. Were there other comments or questions?
Not yet, but while we wait for anyone else, if there's a comment, in the chat box in the beginning, there is a link for a survey. It's very short. Please fill it out. And if you fill it out, we will send you a certificate for contact hours. And feel free to also follow the link in the chat box for our TVI portal in Maryland, where you can check out other webinars coming up. We have webinars coming up on CVI Part 2. We had CVI Part 1 earlier. We have Bookshare, Learning Ally, NFB Newsline. We have Accessible Science. This comment says, this is a helpful webinar. Thank you so much. Also, thank you for sharing the PowerPoint. This one says, we have students that do not have language yet. Sometimes their self-stimulations, behaviors progress into self-injuries. Any insights on how to handle this?
Great question. So there's two approaches that I take to this. One is try to identify the cause. So, for example, I worked with someone who would bang her head against the wall, but there was always a specific trigger that would cause that stim, and that was that there was too much noise, and also that the lights were the fluorescent lights specifically. It wouldn't be just any lights, it was specifically fluorescent lights. So once I was able to identify that trigger, then the need for her to do that decreased significantly. And then if you've done that and you can't seem to decrease the self-injurious type of stimming, then what you can also do is try to introduce other strategies for stimming. So another student that I worked with, for example, would injure himself by stimming. And what we did was we were able to transition him to doing wall push-ups. And that feeling of the resistance in his arms gave him that same sort of outlet, but without hurting himself. And I guess it also made his arm muscles a bit stronger. So a lot of times you can introduce a different stim that's not injurious to help replace the injurious stim. And then also diminish triggers as much as possible.
Thank you. That was great. I did not know that. And there's another comment that says, do you know what the statistic is for students who are blind and autistic?
I missed that word. Do you know, what was that?
Do you know what the statistics are for the students who are blind and autistic?
I see. Unfortunately, I'm not actually sure of the statistics. Also because the definition of blindness is a little bit not, the way we define blindness right now doesn't include the full range of neurological visual impairments, which is very common at this intersection of being blind and autistic. So whatever stats are out there are probably lower than the actual case.
Yeah, and we had a great webinar on CVI. This other person says, what age do you recommend including students in their IEP decisions? Are you mainly talking about kiddos with typical cognitive abilities?
So I would say that that's a very individual, it's a case by case. When the student's at an age where they clearly start expressing preferences for something, and communicating what they prefer through whatever their modality, that's when you should start making sure to include that input. So basically, however soon you're able to communicate, whether that's through, AAC or just, like for example, if the student's obviously happier when the lights are, when there's not so much noise, you can incorporate that, and then you can also ask them questions, and then if they're able to give you some sort of clear answer, then just incorporate that as soon as you can.
Thank you. And this is going to be our last question. I'm so excited that people are asking so many questions. So this one says, do you see a correlation between ONH, optic nerve hypoplasia, and autism? And then this next person says, can I share this webinar with public libraries across the state? So we are actually uploading, this webinar is being recorded, so we will make it live on our YouTube, and you will be able to share it anywhere that you want to. And then, Nai, I'll take it back to you for the connection between optic nerve hypoplasia and autism.
So I actually haven't drilled down to that much detail, but because the optic nerve hypoplasia is part of that neural pathway, it does sort of fall within the fact that I have seen the correlation between neurological visual impairments and autism. And just as a note on terminology, one of the reasons why I'm saying neurological visual impairment and not just CVI for cortical or cerebral is because there's been more research showing that a lot of the process of vision is outside of the primary visual cortex, the occipital area, and outside of the cerebral. So other lobes of the brain can be involved, and that's why there's more of a shift towards using the general term of neurological visual impairment to capture anywhere in the brain where a difference can be causing an effect on the visual processing. So I definitely have seen it between autism and NVI, of which optic hypoplasia is in that sort of, it's along those neural pathways, but is not part of CVI, which is further back in the brain. But I haven't necessarily seen a correlation between optic nerve hypoplasia and autism specifically.
Great. So we have comments saying, thank you, very insightful presentation. Please remember to take the survey. All of your answers are taken into consideration. We are doing these webinars. They started off for Maryland TVIs, but really across the country, people are participating, and in other countries, people are participating. If there's a topic of interest to you, if you would like a part 2 to autism, we can do that. That's what people requested when we did the CVI part 1. Let us know your thoughts, fill out the survey, and we really hoped you enjoyed the webinar and that you'll join us for other webinars, and they're all in the chat box. You can check out the link with the different webinars. Thank you so much, Nai, for your time and for putting this together. Very insightful, and we will share your PowerPoint with everyone else.
Thank you, everybody who joined, and I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions, and have a great rest of your day.